So, okay, once again, we're back with Brother Richard, the editor-in-chief of the Final Call newspaper. And of course, once again, doing the backstory of the cover story of the greatest newspaper in the world, the Final Call newspaper. Of course, we have a different topic, and I'm not sure which order you want to go into, because today, of course, is the anniversary of the World Trade bombing. Of course, we can't pass up the opportunity to discuss that, but we also have a cover, so I'm going to put it on you.
Well, I think it has now been 17, well, first of all, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
It has now been 17 years since the bombing of the World Trade Center. And that incident has ushered into the world almost 20 years of additional suffering, starting with the destruction of Iraq, which spilled over now into Syria, which has spilled over now into the destruction of Libya, which has spilled over now into destruction in West Africa. So what started, and again, we have to go back, and if you go to finalcall.com, you can actually read letters by the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan from almost 20 years ago, where he warned then President Bush that his plan to go into Iraq would really lead the country down a path that would cost it blood and treasure and its standing in the world. So we know that as a result of this fight in Iraq, initially in Afghanistan, there's been no peace, there's no order. We have actually seen in the last few days an increase in bombings and instability in Iraq. So this tells us, really, as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad warned, and you can actually see it on this week's Final Call newspaper, a house doomed to fall. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand that these divine messages are like giving you today's news, tomorrow's news today. So we've seen massive suffering. We saw the rise of ISIS. We saw the rise of Al-Qaeda. We've seen the rise of other associated movements. We know that Osama bin Laden was essentially trained by America, and so were others who were part of the Mujahideen in the 1980s in Afghanistan. They were backed by the Reagan administration. As a matter of fact, at one point, President Reagan, so this would have been the 70s, President Reagan likened them to the founding fathers of America, because at that time, the U.S. was battling against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan for influence and power. Very interesting that now you have a new president who is accused of colluding and being with Russia. So that's a whole another discussion. But out of that, the destruction, war in Afghanistan, the U.S. at that time pulled out of Afghanistan, never made good on its promises to rebuild the country. Osama bin Laden started Al-Qaeda, he and others, watching the spread of U.S. hegemony into the region, watching the growing influence and collusion, if you will, between the state of Israel and its domination and what they saw as humiliation of the Muslim world. So 20 years later, we are still seeing and reaping the fruit of that very, very bitter war. We also know, of course, that the war in Iraq was based on a lie. There were no weapons of mass destruction. And that we learned after then Secretary of State Colin Powell went to the United Nations at that time and talked about evidence that the U.S. had. So this should tell us we should be very vigilant, very skeptical whenever we hear news coming from this government, in particular news that is used to justify war. The Holy Quran, the book of scripture of the Muslim, warns us that when an unrighteous people, a person bring you news, you should look carefully into it, lest you harm a people in error and then be sorry for what you did. So September 11, 2018, the story is still not over. The saga is still not over. Now we're seeing developments in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen, more refugees. We're seeing friction between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We're seeing Mr. Trump and his administration trying to press and push America into a war with Iran. So when we look at these current events, we should also understand there's a history, there's a root. And if you go to finalcall.com or if you subscribe, you can actually get a little insight and perhaps a little better understanding of what's going on in the world today and why it's happening.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So it's interesting as even though with the 9/11 events and the bombing of the World Trade Center is, we're still coming to see what the real story was back then. And that even though that's on a grander scale, we constantly, as you reference the Holy Quran, is that whenever evil man brings you news, we have to look carefully into it. And that's one of the reasons why this discussion, as well as the Final Call newspaper in general, is so important, because we want to find out the stories behind the story. And that comes right back to this edition of the Final Call, killed at home while black. And of course, many of us may have heard the story when it first broke and the stories that came around that. So just starting off with, of course, there's always a lot of news that's going on. Why this cover story?
Well, we really thought that the killing of Botham Shem, who was a native of San Lucia in the Caribbean, he came to America, he educated himself, he graduated from college. He was a great musician with a great love of the church and God, and he shared his gifts through his music ministry. He was a mentor. On a Thursday night, he's in his home, minding his own business. He ends up dead because a police officer, Amber Geiger, shot and killed him. It was such an incredible and in some sense bizarre tragedy. What could be more disturbing than for a man to be in his home, minding his own business? There was no problem. There was no emergency. There was no call for assistance. And yet, somehow or another, and again, the black-white dynamic, a black man ends up being killed by a white female police officer. So we looked at the story. We had brother Jihad Hassan Muhammad, who's based in Dallas, and also associated with the Dallas Weekly, another fine black publication, who wrote our story. And it was really just incredible. The story kept changing. The story kept changing. Initially, it was said that this officer had worked overtime, double shift, came home, lived in the same building as this brother, went to the wrong floor by mistake, went to the wrong apartment by mistake. This is the initial story. Right. Put her key in the door, jiggled the key. He opened the door and somehow or another ended up getting shot. That's the first story. The story by the time we went to press was she got off the elevator, wrong floor, wrong apartment, put the key in the door was unlocked, so the door opened. And she, thinking he was a burglar in her apartment, shot him to death. Now, there are all kinds of fundamental questions. One, I don't know how many keys there are. If I try to go to your house right now, stick my key in the door, one, the key will not fit, number one. If I manage to get it in there, the key is likely, it's just going to be stuck. It's not going to do anything. It's number one. So how do you go from that to opening the door in the first place? Also, if you read the story at finalcall.com, or if you pick it up from one of the brothers, the Fruit of Islam, and you should actually, I would say, it would be a good idea to make it a weekly habit that you connect with one of the FOI, one of the brothers in the Nation of Islam around the country, because the service that they provide in bringing truth to our people is incredible, and it's needed. And this is what supports our work, your support of them, or if you go to finalcall.com and subscribe. But this officer, and you can read about it in our story, in front of Mr. Jones' door is a bright red mat. Wrong floor, bright red mat, wrong apartment number on the wall. None of that registers. Somehow or another gets in the apartment. But then after that, how do you go from I'm in the wrong apartment to deadly force? What was it? The other thing was the woman was finally arrested. Today is Tuesday. She was finally arrested Sunday, about 72 hours after the killing. There are questions about why it took so long. You can read about some of those questions and some of the answers given in our piece in the Final Call. Very tragic. The Prime Minister of St. Lucia actually came with this brother's family to show support, and because his family has made contributions to that Caribbean nation. So this is, again, perhaps the most troubling example about the fragility of black life in America. And it brings us again to a fundamental question. Can we get along with these people in peace? How long will we suffer because we will not leave them? That's another argument. And if you go to finalcall.com, you can read from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. You can actually read an article from the minister this week, rethinking the the old slave master slave relationship. Very important issue. Tragic story. Unfortunately, these are the stories that we have to tell. They aren't the only stories, but they're very important. And if we don't tell these stories, we cannot depend on others to do for us what we can and must do for ourselves.
Thank you. And I noticed you went into and began to talk about the importance of separation. And of course, Student Minister Ava actually just returned from a trip, and we'll probably be getting a little bit more information on that. But I don't, of course, get a chance to really look at the paper before we sit down since this is Tuesday morning, right? And most people don't even have the paper yet. But I noticed the minister's article, which connects to this discussion. It's, just kind of actually we want to get behind the cover stories, but how are those lectures decided? The minister's lecture, which definitely connects to that, rethink the old slave master slave relationship.
Everything we do is tied to a consistent display of truth and a consistent bearing of witness. The news, the analysis that we present, the articles from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the articles from the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. We try to select articles that are in sync, if you will, with either current events or a message that is especially timely for this moment. All of these messages are timely, but truth rings at a certain moment. There's a certain synchronicity at certain times. Where you see something, you read something, it's like, wow, absolutely. So the minister's article about the need to rethink this relationship, where is it taking us, where has it gotten us? And it seems as though these incidents of straight out killing, in addition to this case, if you go to finalcall.com, and if you follow us on @thefinalcall on Twitter, which you should, we had Jordan Edwards, 15 years old. Officer shot him to death a couple years ago. He was in a car leaving a party, going away from a party where there was some kind of ruckus. He was only 15. This officer fired into the car, killing him. And you can read that again in this week's. You can read more about that. That officer was ultimately convicted. But the question that's being raised is, what is the value of a black child's life, because his sentence was seen as lenient? So you really need to get the Final Call to stay abreast of these different stories. So our mission is to tell the truth, and our mission is to show, verify, bear witness to a man we believe is divine, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and a man who we believe is a divine servant, Minister Louis Farrakhan. Those points can be debated, even discussed, but you don't have a good foundation for discussion or debate if you have not looked at both sides of the question. So we invite people to examine the teachings so that they can read, understand, hear, consider, ponder these arguments for themselves and see what makes sense in their minds.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm looking down to see if we have questions. We have a few people who have joined us.
Excellent.
But what I want to do is just really look at, we want your feedback, and your feedback is important as this show grows. Even from the name, we've wrestled around with the name a little bit, but we really want to see how we can get you involved so that we can actually promote the best paper in the country, if not the world, the Final Call newspaper, and find out how we can get those backstories, how we can bring in other individuals, like you said, our brother Jihad in Dallas. We want to bring them in so that you can actually hear from them and ask them questions as well. But if there's no questions online, if there's any words you want to kind of state before we close out, what else should people be looking for in this particular edition?
I mean,
of the
of
Final
course,
Call
we've got a
newspaper?
story about Mayor Rahm Emanuel not running for re-election. Huge story in Chicago. What does that mean for us as a people? What does it mean for the city? We also had black Christians challenging the hypocrisy of white evangelicals in a protest a couple days ago. You want to read about that. We have really a very special story that's really, I mean, something that makes us very proud. And Makti Theater Productions, led by Sister Margaret Makti, will be coming back to Chicago September 15th. That's September 15th, 2018.
This Saturday.
This Saturday with another star-studded production. It's a musical called Testimony, and the production will begin at 7 p.m. at the Reva and David Logan Center for the Arts, located at 915 East 60th Street. So this is again an example of what Islam and the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad produced. A whole revolution in the arts. And not only are the ideas of this production beautiful, the presentation will be beautiful as well. Lastly, we close with our brother Roland Martin, who has launched a new digital media show in cyberspace. You can find him online as well. And again, go to finalcall.com. Follow at Louis Farrakhan on Twitter, and follow at The Final Call on Twitter. And again, give us some feedback. Let us know what you like. Give us your questions. Let us know what you're looking for.
Thank you once again, Brother Richard. And we'll be looking for it. Some may have complained about the audio. You'll be able to get the replay. Please make sure you visit thecollective9.org. That's THE, collective, COLLECTIVE, the number 9.org. And you can actually get the replay with a little extra pictures and some other content as well. So make sure you visit the site. And until next time, we'll see you. And of course, don't forget, visit the finalcall.com as well as digital.finalcall.com so you can get your digital edition of the Final Call.
And make sure that you visit our location where we're on location, the foodie spot in Chicago, 7350.
Yep.
7350 South Stony Island Avenue. Come in and get your coffee, come in and get your cakes and your bean pie. Don't tell nobody that I ate bean pie this morning. Great lunch menu, great dinner menu, great service, great atmosphere. The foodie spot, that's 7350 South Stony Island Avenue here in Chicago in the beautiful South Shore neighborhood. Come on down. And you might, if you hurry, you might be able to pick up a copy of this week's Final Call newspaper.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. please explore the collective9.org website and subscribe to the newsletter. Explore the site and make sure you check out Web TV.